Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is Technique Tuesday. I'm knitting a sweater with lace panels in it currently, so I thought I would demonstrate how I do a gauge swatch for lace. So let's get started. The stitch pattern that I'm using for my sweater is this one right here, this Fancy Diamonds sweater. There are written instructions for it, but there is also a chart. If I am going to be knitting in the round, I would only be knitting what's in between these borders, and I would repeat that over and over again. I'd need some number of multiples of this stitch pattern. So this calls for a multiple of 12 stitches plus 13 stitches. The plus 13 is what you need if you're knitting flat, or if you are knitting in the round but you're not going to knit all of the stitches in the stitch pattern. And that's what I'm doing. I have these wide panels of the stitch pattern on the front and then a narrower one on the back. And so I'm treating that as if I were knitting flat so that I will have the extra stitches for symmetry. For the purposes of my swatch, I'm going to knit this 25 stitch by 32 row chart. I'm going to put that in my swatch because I'm looking at a gauge where it's 22 stitches and 28 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And so I want to have enough multiples and repeats of the lace pattern that it will be at least 4 inches. So this is a pretty big multiple and a very long repeat, so I only need one of these. If you have something smaller, you want to knit enough of them that you think it will fill up about 4 inches or a little bit more than 4 inches. And that's what I'm starting with. I'm starting with these 25 stitches and these 32 rows in my swatch. But the swatch needs to be bigger than that. One way to do it would be to say, well, this is what I want. This is the lace pattern, and I want to make the swatch bigger. And so I'm going to knit stockinette stitches all the way around it. So you figure out how many stockinette stitches you want on each side and how many stockinette rows you want. And then you can cast on the number of stitches that you're going to need for your lace pattern plus your stockinette border. That's one way to do it. The downside of doing it this way is if you don't have a pattern where there's purl stitches. A lot of lace patterns are just knit stitches, yarn overs, and decreases. And so there's not always an obvious column where you can say this is where the stitch pattern is. For this pattern, I do have that, but for many, if not most lace patterns, you won't have purl stitches. That could be a problem in finding where the edge of the lace pattern is when you're trying to measure it later. What I like to do is to have a garter stitch border. Some people will say you shouldn't do a garter stitch border around anything that's stockinette based because the gauge is different and that's going to distort your gauge. And I avoid that issue by doing a couple of things. First, I lay out my stitch pattern. I've got my 20 stitch lace pattern here. I have an extra column of stockinette adjacent to that. And then I have my garter stitch border on the edges. So I want 33 stitches all the way across for this. Garter stitch, when you're looking at it going all the way across, it tends to be a little wider than stockinette or lace would be. You can counter that by casting on 10% fewer stitches for the bottom border. What I did instead of casting on 33 stitches is I cast on 30 stitches. This is showing that there's no stitch. I've got 30 stitches here that I'm actually casting on and working in garter stitch. And then on the final right side row of garter stitch, as I work across, I do an increase. I do 3 of them in order to make up the 3 that I didn't cast on earlier. So I've got my increases, and because I want to start my stitch pattern on a right side row, then I do a garter border, I purled across, it was the wrong side row, purled across, and then did garter stitch, and then I could start. And then at the end, after I've worked my final wrong side row of my lace pattern and I'm ready to start garter stitch, Then I decrease out my extra stitches and I work some garter stitch for a few ridges and then I bind off. So what this does for me is it gives me a stockinette border all the way around my lace pattern, and then I have my garter stitch surrounding that. And that's going to make it really easy to find where the stitch pattern is, because I know I can see where garter stitch is, and then there's a column of stockinette next to it, and the lace pattern is within it. So I've finished my swatch, but it needs to be washed and blocked. So I have a salad spinner that I use in my craft room for washing things like swatches. So I'm just going to stick it in that. I have some Eucalan. You wouldn't have to use that. You can just be plain water. Squeeze it a little bit to help the air get out, and I'm going to let it sit for 20 minutes. All right, so it's been 15 to 20 minutes. I took this out of the bowl. I squeezed it, but it's still very damp. So I'm going to roll it up in a towel. Squeeze as much water out as I can. Then I'm going to lay it out on this pad here. And what I want to do is just smooth this out. I'm just smoothing it out. And what the borders allow to happen is for the edges to not roll. Because we increased at the end of the garter border and then we decreased at the beginning of this one, these borders are not flaring out like this like they would if we'd used the same number of stitches. So I'm just letting it lie flat like this, and then I'll let it dry overnight, and then we can do the measuring. All right, it's the next day. It's time to measure my swatch. Remember, I'm looking for a gauge that is 22 stitches over 4 inches. I'm not going to take my ruler, measure 4 inches, and then try to count those stitches. That can be really hard in lace. Instead, I'm going to look at my pattern. Remember, I had 25 stitches across, and I worked this for 32 rows. So I know how many stitches I worked in pattern, and I know how many rows I worked in pattern. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure from the very edge of those extra stockinette stitches. Those are not going to be in the measurement. I'm going to measure the 25 stitches that's between those 2 stitches. So there is a purl column in there, but it's hiding, it's receding. So I'm going from the edge of one stockinette stitch to the edge of the other. And what's in between those 2 stitches are the 25 stitches I worked. And I have 4.5 stitches. So what I do now is I divide the number of stitches that I'm measuring by the 4.5 inches. So I have 25 stitches. I'm going to divide it by those 4 stitches, and I get 5.55555. That is close enough for me to 5.5 stitches per inch. So I'm doing this in inches. If you work in centimeters, you would measure it across in centimeters and divide the 25 stitches by centimeters, by the number of centimeters wide it is, and you would have the number of stitches per centimeter. And then for measuring the length, this is the one where I did increases, and this is the one where I purled across. So I'm going to measure from the base of that stitch that's right above my fingernail, and then across here in my first knit row all the way across is where I did my decreases, and I can see I have a little purl stitch right here. So I'm going to measure from between those 2 places to get my length. So what I'm measuring here is just over 4 inches, about 4 1/8 inches. And so I have 32 rows in there. So I've got 32 rows divided by, I'm going to say it's 4 1/8 inches. So I've got 7 3/4 inches. My pattern wants me to have 7 rows per inch, wants 28 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So I might have to adjust the number of rows I work in my pattern in order to get this to work out. Or I can check as I go with the actual item, check my gauge again and see if it's closer to this number or if it's closer to the number that I'm looking for. The most important gauge is typically the stitch gauge. I do like this method better than just having stockinette around the sides because I do feel like it's easier to figure out where the boundaries are of what it is you're trying to measure when you don't have just stockinette to the side. But that you have the garter stitch, the column of stockinette, and then whatever between that is what you're measuring. You may be wondering why I knit my swatch flat when I'm knitting my sweater in the round. The usual advice is to knit the swatch as you intend to knit the garment. But I know from decades of knitting experience that my gauge when knitting flat is no different than when I knit in the round. So I am comfortable knitting a lace swatch flat. But if you know or suspect that your flat gauge and in the round gauge is different and you're planning to knit your project in the round, use a method of swatching that fakes knitting in the round. Well, that's it for this week's Technique Tuesday video. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.